liberalisation. And there's a tendency to think that liberalisation is of itself a good thing. And we know that the last Labour government really promoted free trade. But what we're realising through Brexit is how incredibly complicated trade arrangements are and how they're linked to all kinds of regulations and standards, and how difficult it is actually to disentangle ourselves from the European Union, and what on earth might be ahead of us if we make trade deals with other countries. So I think it's really important we start thinking about what would a future Labour government do about trade deals and what constitutes trade justice. And we've got two fantastic speakers, Nick Dearden, who runs Global Justice Now and has just done a wonderful little book called Trade Secrets, which exposes all the problems of possible future deals, and Sharon Treat, who was a Democratic congressman from Maine and is now a senior attorney in the US Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. So are we going to start with you, Nick?
Yeah. Do you want me to go?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much. So I'm going to keep what I've got to say to 15 minutes. And I'm going to start in a very unusual way for me by quoting Tony Blair at a Labour Party conference in 2005, talking about globalization. And by globalization, I think Blair was mainly talking about trade rules, certainly trade rules as we've come to understand them since. He said, I hear people say we have to stop and debate globalization. You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. The new world rewards those who are open to it. The temptation for us is to use the government to try to protect ourselves against the onslaught of globalization by shutting it out, to think we can protect a workforce by regulation, a company by government subsidy, or an industry by tariffs. It just doesn't work today. That's really interesting. And very, very similar claims were made at the time by Bill Clinton in the United States. And that moment really represented a turning point in what social democracy had to offer to the public. The stress was that no longer would we try to plan, control, regulate, or constrain economic forces for the public good. We'd sort of let them rip and try to compete as best we can against every other country in the world who we assumed would do the same. And that was really where I think social democracy had got to up until 5, 6, 7 years ago. And sadly, it kind of took Trump, I think, in many ways, to force many on the centre left to think again about this approach to globalization. Now, Trump came to power for many different reasons, but at least in part, I think it was based on a seething resentment built up over many years against the way that the global economy works and the way that the global economy had treated many people. And I think we really need to learn this lesson, because if social democratic parties want to come to power again and truly transform things, we need to design a very different framework for our economy, and at the center of that is redesigning how trade works. And let me say at the outset, obviously we don't want to be against trade. In fact, I don't think you really can be against trade in the modern world. It's kind of just a fact of life. The important thing is the rules that govern trade and in whose interests they work. And I'm not for a minute suggesting that we should become kind of protectionists or engage in trade wars in the way that Donald Trump did. But I do think that we absolutely need to say that trade liberalization as a goal in itself should not be the point of economic policy for left-wing governments. Because if it is, we will be absolutely unable to offer the majority of people in our society the more secure future that I think so many people crave. We'll be unable to control and reverse inequality, one of the main problems in the world today, and will be completely unable to deal with climate change. In fact, we'll have surrendered really the whole power and purpose of being in government to the laws of the market. And the reason for that is that current trade rules and the trade system that we've got today really encapsulate the laws of the market. They protect the rights or the supposed rights of big business and big capital, and they discipline governments when those governments step out of line and contradict the desires of capital to profit and exploit wherever it wants to in the world. And I'm very briefly in the next 5 minutes going to kind of explain why that is. For us, free trade has historically been about open markets and low tariffs. But in the 1990s, that was interpreted in an extremely broad way. And more aspects of the economy and of our society started to be incorporated into trade rules. There's a good reason for this. Trade rules were very enforceable after the World Trade Organization was set up. And so if you're a business lobbyist, what you wanted to do was try to get your the particular thing you wanted to change into trade law, because if it was in trade rules, if it was in trade law, it was enforceable. And in that way, you had all sorts of things that suddenly became part of the rules of the global economy, part of the rules of global trade. For example, intellectual property, the price that we pay for medicines and who controls our medicines, that became part of international trade law in the mid-90s. Trade law became about removing obstacles to the liberalization of the service industry. And the service industry is extremely broad. I mean, kind of defined really in trade terms as anything you can't drop on your foot. And particularly concerning for us, that includes many aspects of what we've traditionally regarded as the public sector and public services. Removing obstacles to the liberalization of services became a key goal in trade policy. Removing obstacles to capital going where it wants in the world and behaving how it wants, when it wants, on whatever terms it wants, became a key component of trade policy. And very often the obstacles to be removed, the impediments to be removed from this free flow of goods, services and capital around the world are the very regulations that we as socialists and social democrats fight for and have fought for many years. And I'm going to take as the example to kind of explain this, our famous friends, the chlorine chickens. Chlorine chickens really became synonymous, both with TTIP, the big EU-US trade deal that we stopped, but also with the UK-US trade deal that hopefully we've stopped, but Sharon might be able to shed a little bit more light on that when she speaks. But chlorine chicken essentially are a really good example of how in modern trade deals, products made to very different standards come to be regarded as the same in order to get access for those standards to new markets. So food production in the US is very different from food production in Britain. It's not to say our food production is anything like perfect, but really industrial agriculture has taken hold of the US economy in a huge way. And anybody who's been over to the US for work or pleasure will probably have seen, if you've been to the countryside, some of the most enormous kind of industrial scale farms. And within those farms, animal welfare practices are extremely different to our own. And for a long time, industrial agriculture in the US has been saying we really hate European food standards because we can't export many of our products into European markets. And so the goal for those businesses is to push for their food to be regarded as the same, called mutual recognition, as the food that's produced here. Now, it's fine to regard two products as the same if they are kind of the same. I mean, you might not worry about the exact production process, but if they're kind of as safe, if the animal welfare standards are as high and whatever, okay, fine, you can regard two things as the same. But what we see in modern trade deals is that things that are radically different actually come to be regarded as the same. And that means that where goods are produced to lower standards, they're suddenly allowed into markets under these rules, and they're allowed into markets where you can't produce goods to those standards yourself in our markets. So what you would see under a US trade deal, if Big Ag got its way, would be all sorts of products coming into the market here, produced to a very different and much lower standard, which our own farmers here couldn't produce to. And of course, what's that going to mean? It's going to mean that your own farming community becomes uncompetitive. It simply can't compete. And it either goes out of business or it spends its time convincing the government to lower food standards here so they can become competitive again. And it's in that way that we modern trade policy becomes a kind of race to the bottom in terms of standards. People are most interested in food standards, but actually it applies right the way across the board. It applies to cosmetics, it applies to chemical regulation, it can even apply to workers' rights standards, and so on and so forth. And while some people say, well, that's consumer choice, isn't it? Really, that's a disingenuous argument, particularly because the very same interests that are arguing for these lower standards to be allowed into markets supermarkets are also against food labelling. So actually, it would be impossible for the consumers really even to make an informed choice. Now, I'm not going to go on and on because we haven't got very long. If you want like more examples of kind of how this works and how it applies to services and other parts of our economy, take a look at my book. It's free, and you can see it from the website. It's called Trade Secrets, as Mary said. I'll try and post a link in a little bit. But what I do want to say in the last few minutes that I've got is how we begin to reverse this thinking. Modern trade rules are based on the idea, as I said, that endless liberalization will create endless growth. And that's kind of the objective of them, really. Now, even if endless growth was compatible with dealing with climate change, and it clearly isn't, given that the current global state of the global economy is dominated by enormously wealthy transnational corporations and enormously wealthy individuals, endless liberalization is mainly going to entrench and exacerbate the power of those institutions and individuals who've more or less created the trade rules that we've got in their own interests. And as I said at the start, that doesn't mean that we as left-wing activists need to erect tariff barriers everywhere or convert the country to protectionism wholesale. But if we do want to keep markets relatively open, if we do want relatively low tariff barriers, we have to make sure, absolutely fundamentally, that the government is in a position to control, to constrain, and to redistribute the benefits of trade to the whole population and prevent damage to the environment. And that means a very strong right to regulate is absolutely essential. But sadly, it is exactly that right to regulate which is challenged by modern trade rules. And so we need to fundamentally change that if we're to have trade that can possibly work for people and planet. There's an economist I really love called Danny Roderick, who's very good on this. And he says, actually, the freer the trade you have, the more open your market is, the more the government requires a right to regulate, the more you need a strong welfare state, the more you need the ability to intervene and plan and build decent welfare resources and an industrial strategy. The idea that free trade and the free market actually go together is fundamentally wrong, in his opinion. And that's why countries like Britain that have tried to do those things have become incredibly unequal over time. By the way, he also says that endless liberalization, even of tariffs, is not going to make very much difference beyond a certain point, and that the cost to parts of the community of lowering tariffs on goods beyond a certain point is almost certain not to really be worthwhile for your economy as a whole. So what does that mean for us as campaigners and activists? I think it means pushing the Labour leadership and the Labour Party on trade and the global economy in general. I think the current leadership gives far too much credence to the kind of Blair way of thinking about things, this framing that we can't really do anything about it, so let's embrace it and try and make it a bit nicer. I think we've got to be much less afraid to oppose trade deals. And by the way, I think large parts of the country are already there. I think large numbers of people are very, very nervous about the impact of trade deals. But what Labour can do is ensure we frame the terms of trade so as well as opposing dangerous trade deals, we're also shifting the narrative from one of economic nationalism to one of international cooperation and building a fairer world. That means talking and thinking about trade in a fundamentally different way, a radical trade policy where we could honestly say how aspects of the global economy have caused immense precarity and marginalization here and around the world. And rather than saying we can't do anything about that, to say we can do something about it. And it's going to be really important to say we can do something about it, because that's where the challenge from now parts of the right wing are going. They're saying we can do something about this. It's vital that social democratic parties say, yes, we can do something about it too, and it will look very different and better than the threats coming from the right. I also think we've got to start working with parties around the world, because there are really no social democratic or socialist parties in the world that have got really good answers to this. This hasn't been something we've tried for a long time to really fundamentally rethink how trade works. And I'm really, really delighted that Sharon's here today, because I hope she's going to say something about the signs of hope in the US. And I think we should be working with forces in the US as Labour activists in terms of thinking about how we could do this. Final sentence, like this isn't marginal. Hopefully what I've convinced you of is rethinking trade, rethinking the global economy is absolutely central to whether and how progressive parties can really take back control of our economies on behalf of the people that we're supposed to represent, and make that offer to people that will put progressive parties in government again. Thank you.
Gosh, that was perfect timing. And so clear and interesting. This is a really important issue. So Now I'm going to ask Sharon to tell us about what's going on under the Biden administration and anything else she wants to talk about.
Okay, well, thanks so much. I appreciate having the opportunity to be part of this. And first, I'm going to correct the record and say that I have never been in Congress, but I did represent people in the state of Maine for 22 years in our legislature, both in the House and the Senate.
Oh, sorry.
Well, that's quite all right. Some would say it wouldn't be a promotion to be in Congress. What I can say, though, is that being in a state level legislature where a great deal of the policy takes place in the United States is actually a perfect place to learn about trade policy. And where I live, we actually have a Citizen Trade Policy Commission that advises both our members of Congress as well as our state government. And that's sort of how I got into this and learned a lot. I really came to trade policy from being an environmentalist, and now I work with an agricultural organization, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, which is really focused on ensuring that we have sustainable agriculture that's good not only for farmers, but also is long-term good for the environment and results in good food. And we're very much a social justice organization as well, so we fit very well within the frame of the open labor movement. Nick has laid out, in very quick but broad detail, a lot of our approach. And I did want to just mention before I get into my initial remarks, in addition to Nick's book, there's a great deal of material on our website where you can delve into it in short blog sourced kind of bites, if that is of interest to you. I think that this is a really important moment in the United States around trade policy. And some of it comes because of the disruption of the Trump years, where basically Trump was kind of leaning into messages coming from the middle of the United States and from places like where I live, where many jobs have been lost during this trade liberalization era, but also where he essentially used tariffs as some kind of a political weapon. And in a very disruptive way, kind of, went into it with this sort of America first, approach, which just like what came before, didn't really do much to help people. And I think that at this point, we have a new trade representative, the top position in the United States around trade policy, Katherine Tai, who actually was the negotiator for the members of the House of Representatives during the Trump administration, when House members, Democrats, sought to improve the newly negotiated USMCA or new NAFTA that had been negotiated by the Trump administration, and tried to fix up parts of it, in particular, access to medicines and the enforceability, particularly of labor standards. And this is a really important effort, but unfortunately, that same agreement incorporates vast amounts of approaches and rules that were initially negotiated both in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think is a really bad old style agreement, as well as the TTIP. And it's almost like the US was learning from the European Union on some of their kind of regulatory approaches. And so there's still a long way to go. Now, Tai herself in her confirmation hearing has talked about a worker-centric trade policy. And I think she's coming from the right place, as is the Biden administration. And I think there's a real recognition that just opening up trade and sort of doing nothing else in the rest of the country in terms of really humming up with policies that, promote, kind of fair jobs and fair wages and sustainability overall, both in the economy and the environment, that's not a winning economic policy. And just relying on having a whole lot of trade and having rules that essentially make trade easy for corporations, but don't really think about the consequences, has not been a policy that really has lifted all boats. It's basically, we're just seeing increasing stratification in society and the rich getting richer and everybody everybody else not really doing any better. So it is a moment when we can think differently about things. And Ty has said that with respect to agreements that are partially negotiated, including the agreement with the UK, that she's going to do a relook at this. And I think that there's a lot of steam around groups like my own and others that have been working on climate and other policies to really push hard to say, this is a moment to really change what you're doing. Don't just stick on some sustainability chapter or something and say, okay, now, it addresses climate change. We really need to look at the model from top to bottom. And I think that there's a greater understanding now of some of the ways that these trade agreements really restrict what governments can do, and do so in a way that is pretty much driven by very, very large multinational corporations that are seeking to essentially do whatever they want to do without restrictions that cost them money and which, force them to abide by various environmental and other kinds of standards. And so this is, we see this in the most recent agreement that the US has negotiated, where, as Nick has said, there's all kinds of provisions that make it more difficult to label foods or other products with, say, what the toxic components are, which, make you go through all kinds of sort of heavy duty regulatory reviews that essentially give these same businesses, which actually have a preferred access to the negotiators in the US trade and negotiating system, they actually have been known to, in my personal experience, write entire articles and chapters of these trade agreements and hand them over to the the formal government trade negotiators, and say, okay, here you go. And then they start showing up in the trade agreements, very specifically doing things like making it difficult to label food that's junk food, to say that this causes obesity, for example. And there's a lot of things going on in the UK right now that I think, are real opportunities, whether it's around, addressing things like obesity, or whether it's around coming up with new policies on agriculture that, as you separate from the cap policies and the subsidy policies of the European Union and develop your own standards, you really, I think, wouldn't want to be put in a situation where you're stuck in a box having to do the same old that has been going on forever and is not solving any problems and is actually standing in the way of addressing climate and other things. And there's a lot of things in these trade rules, aside from the labeling and things like that, that make it very difficult to promote, say, renewable energy policies with different, sort of targeted subsidies that focus on making that more affordable for people, or policies that focus on, growing your local economies, whether it's, local food policy, or whether it's putting up renewable energy policy, renewable energy through solar panels or wind farms, whatever it may be. These are things that get in the way. And trade itself, of course, promoting, vast travel of goods across oceans, which is indeed what a US-UK trade agreement would promote, right there are essentially adding to global warming in a way that sometimes doesn't really seem to make sense when we're trading things that are produced at home very well and that there already is a market for, and perhaps doesn't really make sense to do that. So I think that there's a lot of areas where we really need to rethink what goes into these trade agreements and what they should be achieving. And I think there is that opportunity. What I don't see right now coming from the current UK government is a recognition of that. I've been following it very closely. I actually serve on an advisory council that represents state and local government for the US trade representative in the past, and we'll see where that goes going forward. But the statements I've seen coming from Liz Truss and others is that, this is our golden opportunity to just enter into a zillion different trade agreements as quickly as possible. Well, these trade agreements are not, they don't take into account differences and changes that we are now recognizing, that people like Catherine Tai recognizes, and even the former US Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who worked very hard to get investor-state dispute settlement out of the agreement between Canada and Mexico that was renegotiated, the new NAFTA. And that is a mechanism that allows, corporations to sue governments to challenge policies, whether it's energy policy, whether it's environmental policy, whether it's food labeling, you name it. These are cases that have been pursued, labeling of tobacco. These are cases that have been pursued all over the world and are very much focused on any policies that reduce corporate profits. This is not something that should be in a trade agreement whatsoever, yet we see the UK government in its negotiating objectives refusing to take it out of there and keeping it open as an option, and talking about getting into trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that still have investor-state dispute settlement in there, which are essentially corporate courts with tremendous conflicts of interest. And even, the European Union has been rethinking its role there. So to see the UK sort of talking about these kinds of trade agreements that are old school trade agreements that even people in the United States are really rethinking, which has been sort of you talked about Bill Clinton. He pushed the original NAFTA, and which had one of the first versions, and certainly the first versions of the investor-state dispute settlement that applied to the United States. He pushed that, and now we're seeing a real reassessment of that, and we need to really, I think, seize the moment between that and the existential threat of climate change and global warming to say this is the moment when we have to really redesign this and not just go on as business as usual. And I think that's an opportunity not only for the United States, but very much so for the UK, which has things being upended in many ways around Brexit. And the positive side here is that this is an opportunity to rethink how these things are going forward. So I would just say that, and I think that Nick is right to say there are many groups, including my own, that are very interested in working across borders and focus internationally on these, and we're really looking forward to doing that going forward.
Well, thank you very much, and it's good to have you as an ally in the United States. And that's really going to be my first question, and then there are quite a lot of questions in the chat, but I wanted to ask a question, which is, you said maybe leaving the EU is an opportunity for us to think about our standards. But actually, it sort of seems to me to draw attention to how small we are. And can we really, without a sort of progressive global partnership, actually change trade policy? I mean, we can be protectionist maybe, but that has other consequences. So I suppose that's a question to both of you. Isn't it that we want to change? We want everyone to have the standards we have.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's right. But at least to begin with, you don't enter into a trade agreement that limits your own and whoever you're writing the trade agreement with, what you can do. I mean, you don't shrink your policy space right off the bat to make it almost impossible to do that, to have those standards that move upwards and that move in that direction. So, I mean, that's the first thing. I think there's a lot of stuff in these trade agreements that if I was in charge, which is never going to happen, but if I was in charge, I would cut out about minimum half of the 34 chapters that are in the USMCA, which have nothing to do with trade. What they have to do with is saying, these are the kinds of rules that you have to follow anytime you want to adopt regulations that deal with food safety, or these are the kind of rules you have to follow before you put a medical device on the marketplace. And what are those rules? Those rules are put it on the market first, then go test the safety. That has no place probably anywhere, but it certainly doesn't have a place in an international trade agreement. The place for that kind of policy is in your domestic policies. So I think, I don't know if the UK can lead the world. It's, but you don't start by tying your hands from the beginning, And you have a lot of influence too. I do think, certainly in places like the US, that is a place where like-minded people could be promoting a really different kinds of thing and have it grow from there, as opposed to what I do think was behind the Trump administration's negotiation of the trade agreement with the UK, which was trying to actually have a wedge where the US would get the UK to agree to lower standards and then use that as a jumping off point to go after the standards in the European Union and get those to be lowered as well. And I actually do think that's part of where the US was coming from.
Oh, thank you. Do you want to say anything to that, Nick, or shall I go on to more questions?
I mean, just to say that for me, I think for the government that we've got at the moment, the purpose, core to the purpose of Brexit was allowing us to do a number of trade deals, which was going to lock us in to a different regulatory system. Sharon said before, and I quote it whenever I can, because I think it's a great way of thinking about it. A US trade deal for the Johnson administration is not about us buying more American goods and America buying more British goods. I mean, that might be a small part of it, but basically it's about importing a different regulatory system. And that's also what the Trans-Pacific Partnership is about for them. It is about breaking with this EU system, which is relatively high standards. I think, of course, we could do things better. There's always room to do things better, but relatively high standards to a lower, more market-driven regulatory system. And when they talk about trade, that's what they mean. And for me, that was always the purpose of Brexit for that lot.
Well, I will follow that with a very specific question from Alex about the Trade and Pacific Partnership, which is how is it going to affect human rights in the Pacific, for instance, the genocide in West Papua? I think that's a question that actually has its own answer, but Nick may want to say something, or Sharon.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to say, I mean, you probably saw last week after the awful integrated defense review, that bit of Rab speaking to his staff that was leaked, where basically he said, human rights standards shouldn't get in the way of us signing a good trade deal. Otherwise, we wouldn't sign a trade deal with anybody in the world. And I think that is one example of like the way that trade could definitely play in to human rights abuses. But that's a rather indirect way, but there are many direct ways that it can feed into human rights abuses and environmental abuses too. I mean, look at a potential deal with Brazil at the moment, which the EU is engaged in, and many campaigners are trying to stop it. And I think they've got a fairly good chance, actually. Britain also wants a trade deal with Brazil. That a direct result of a trade deal with Brazil under the Bolsonaro leadership is likely to be that it would increase markets for soy and other products which are driving the destruction of the rainforest. So a really direct example of how trade deals can fuel human rights abuses around the world.
And I guess the comment I would make on that is that I agree with everything Nick said. But I'd also like to say, just because you put the names comprehensive and progressive in front of Trans-Pacific Partnership doesn't make it comprehensive and progressive. And this is where, Justin Trudeau comes in and says, now we're part of it. We're going to, the US is out. Now it's comprehensive and progressive. No, it's not. It's the same deal that was negotiated before, except that they suspended some of it because they were so offensive, provisions relating to biologics and other medicines and pricing of those medicines that only the US wanted. And by being in this agreement, I mean, it's pretty shocking that, of these other countries agreed to what the US wanted when none of them obviously wanted it, since they suspended it as soon as the US went out. But it's still just suspended. And if the US were ever to come back in again, potentially those things could raise their head again. And, and that's just a caution I have. I just think it's really important, whether you're talking about human rights, environmental and ag policy, you don't fix these trade agreements by just sticking some chapter on it or giving it a new title. It really needs to be, because they're just throughout these trade agreements, there's these provisions from beginning to end that really tie hands and or promote basically cheaper everything, which a lot of times the way you get cheaper everything is by abusing people and not paying fair wages and essentially slave labor, et cetera, or close to it. So it's just a real caution that and I think the EU engages in a lot of this kind of greenwashing where they put on a little, they negotiate agreement that's not really very good. And then people object to it saying this is really anti-environmental or whatever. And then they stick some language in on some fairly unenforceable part of the agreement that everybody agrees to. And that's what's going on right now with the EU-Mercosur agreement, that Nick alluded to with respect to Brazil and some other countries there. And I think a lot more needs to be done, but it can be done. You can develop a trade policy. It doesn't mean you have to stop trading. And of course, the US and the EU and the UK are all trading right now without a trade agreement, just to be clear about that.
Thank you. There's a question also about climate change and whether the climate change talks can foster technology transfer and support for adaptation for countries that haven't contributed to climate change but suffer from it. And actually, I have another question about developing countries, but let's answer that first and then I'll come to it.
So I think when it comes to climate change, this is one of the main things that we've got to be really cautious of around, signing trade deals at the moment. I mean, there's the basic obvious thing that Sharon and I have both referred to, which is increasing the production endlessly of goods and their transportation around the world is not likely to be positive for climate change. So we've clearly got to think about that before anything else. But there are more specific things in terms of how trade deals tie the hands of government and limit their right to regulate, which are going to be a real problem in terms of us being able to deal with climate change. Because guess what? In order to deal with climate change, governments need to intervene in the economy in a massive way. I mean, we're probably all agreed on that. And the last thing they need is a bunch of trade rules which say, if you do that, we're going to sue you. If you do that, we're going to challenge you around industrial agriculture. There's even stuff in some trade deals which directly contribute to and lock in the trade in fossil fuels around the world. I mean, Canada's terrible for this, actually, really trying to incorporate into trade deals its right to export tar sands into various markets around the world. One of the most awful fossil fuels that we've got. So they're really problematic. And particularly, I really want to say the thing that Sharon referred to, this investor-state dispute settlement, which we call corporate courts, which is a parallel legal process, essentially, for big business in your trading partner countries that allows those companies to sue a government for pretty much anything said company does not like. So you have cases at the moment where the Netherlands is being sued by a power company because they've said they want to phase out coal-fired power by 2030. And a company which runs coal-fired power stations in the Netherlands is suing the Netherlands for that decision. Canada has been routinely sued on a number of occasions by corporations whenever it tries to stop a mine or put a moratorium on fracking. So, I mean, this is craziness. I mean, it really is, to give corporations the power to, and the British government is one of the most gung-ho in the world about these ISDS clauses, chapters that give corporations this power. So they're a complete disaster. And for me, you need to take out things like ISDS, but you also need to put stuff right at the front of the trade deal, which is binding and enforceable, that says nothing in this trade deal will prevent a government from abiding by its climate commitments under the Paris Agreement. You absolutely need to make these things subservient, because at the moment it's the other way around. Trade deals are way more enforceable than anything we've agreed on climate change, and that just cannot be right.
Just to reinforce that.
That's really important.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce that, I mentioned how Robert Lighthizer worked to get ISDS, or corporate courts, out of the USMCA or new NAFTA. However, even though there is no ISDS in that agreement with Canada, it retained it in its kind of worst form, the form that had been before, for fossil fuel agreements and cases, among others. So it's kind of a pretty clear recognition of the, the power of the industry, number one, but also, how these provisions are really inconsistent. I just make also the point that one of the problems you have here is that you have agreements like the Paris Agreement on climate, which is unenforceable. I mean, it's countries agreeing to things within their own countries, and it's not an enforceable thing like a trade agreement is enforceable or WTO rules are enforceable. And a lot of WTO rules in particular are some of the ones that really don't fit in with addressing climate change around these issues, around the subsidies that Nick has pointed out, and other provisions where it has been essentially used to stop renewable energy and other things. So I think that starting with a statement in a new trade agreement saying nothing will stop with Paris is a good start. But it's one of these fundamental inconsistencies. You also have international agreements around public health that aren't enforceable, yet the trade agreements are. And so the trade agreements end up trumping everything else. And it's, I think part of the solution here may be to try to, if it's possible, move towards more enforceability around some of the other things and not trying to stick everything into a trade agreement, which is really trying to accomplish something quite different.
I'm sure you're right. And also, it's not only trying to accomplish something quite different, but it's so obscure to people. So if if you're going to deal with health or climate change rather than via another route. And that brings me to a question about COVID. There's a question about the resolution to the WTO on waiving international intellectual property rights on COVID-19 vaccines. Is this going to go anywhere? Is it desirable even? We want to stop companies making profits, but do we want to waive intellectual property rights altogether?
Do you want me to start? I mean, I definitely think we do, because it's one of our main campaigns at the moment.
Okay, I'll believe anything you say.
But look, but let's look behind it, because I think we need to do more than waive it. We need to rewrite the TRIPS agreement, full stop, because it isn't just about COVID. It's about, we already talked about the need for technology transfer to deal with climate change, so that countries don't all have to reinvent the wheel, and we can learn from each other and share. Exactly the same thing with medicines. And look, if you want to see the real damage that the intellectual property provisions in trade law have done, just look at the pharmaceutical industry. It is a thoroughly dysfunctional industry. I know this year that people think, oh, great, in 12 months they've invented some vaccines. And that is wonderful. It's wonderful science, but it's being funded by the public sector, because any really important breakthrough that the pharmaceutical industry comes up with is funded by the public sector, because the industry itself is not fit for purpose. And that's goes right back to the fact that they're essentially monopolies whose products are protected for 20 years, and they're going to make massive amounts of money off any product in that time. And therefore, they don't really have an interest in doing risky research. They have an interest in fighting legal suits to protect and extend their patents and improve the patentability of their products and the secrecy they're allowed to employ in future trade agreements. It's called the TRIPS Plus agenda. They're at it all the time. They spend huge amounts of money, with mergers and acquisitions. They're a highly financialized industry. And as I say, all the good things that basically come out is because we pump public research money into it. We then privatize that research and allow the pharmaceutical corporations to make money off this for years to come. And it just stinks. And this isn't something which is just coming from the left. I mean, we've done work on this where Jim O'Neill, who's a former bigwig at Goldman Sachs and a Tory lord, is saying you really need to nationalize parts of this industry because it's not fit for purpose. So for me, absolutely, we do need to waive this, because and it's a real example of with trade deals, we've got this idea of the open market and the free market, and you have this kind of, people probably have this idea in their head of a kind of little Adam Smith style kind of farmers market where there's perfect information and perfect competition. The trade system that we've got has created a world which would actually have Adam Smith spinning in his grave in some ways. I mean, it's created monopoly capitalism. And it's the same when you look at big tech. It's the same when you look at big ag. All of the players pushing for trade law, for new trade rules are pushing for rules that convey even more privilege onto their monopoly position in the global economy and prevent governments from being able to do anything about it. It's anti-competitive in many ways.
Yeah, and the Biden administration hasn't agreed yet, to support waiving these rules, but if they did, I think they would be waived. So our IATP is among many organizations in civil society in the U.S. that have been pressuring members of Congress and the president to, change their views on this, because if you cannot do this in a pandemic, I just can't imagine, and even from just basic self-interest, which is not how I would like to frame it, but there seems to be a lack of understanding that everybody in this world needs to get a vaccine, and it needs to be affordable. And we can't just have, richer countries, hoarding vaccine and in this case, allowing the pharmaceutical industry to continue to make just massive profits unnecessarily. And Nick is right. I mean, in the US as well, much of the initial scientific research around producing these vaccines was publicly funded. And then, of course, there's massive amounts of public money that went to pay for the actual vaccine. And now, the Biden administration, and I'm glad he is doing this, but he's, invoking the Defense Production Act to actually help make sure that it gets manufactured. So, these kinds of trade provisions need to recognize reality, but Nick is right. I kind of jumped over it in my initial comments, but I was going to focus a bit on just the whole concentration of the agriculture industry, of tech, of all of these things has indeed been promoted by these trade agreements, among other things. And, that is something that we also need to be looking at and making sure, not only in the trade space, but that also in our competition and anti-monopoly approaches, that we're taking a look at that, because it's just really dysfunctional. And once again, who is, who's reaping the benefits and where's the harm going?
Gosh, look, we've got only a very few minutes left, but I just I wondered whether we shouldn't talk about global justice. I mean, I'm so struck I study forever wars, and most of them begin after a liberalization of trade. I'm not saying that's the only factor, but it's when people are thrown out of agriculture, they come to the towns, they're unemployed because they can no longer compete, the subsidies have been taken away. So should we be designing trade deals so that they do actually favor trade with developing countries, or should we have a completely different strategy in order to address this huge global injustice?
The one thing sorry.
No, go on, Sharon, go on, because I'm interested in what you've got to say.
Let Sharon start.
I was just gonna say that, in addition to the UK negotiations that have been going on in the under the Trump administration, there was also a negotiation with Kenya. And, that could be a really positive thing, but the whole approach has been to just use the exact same trade agreement that they were proposing with the UK, essentially. And we already see like giant chemical corporations like jumping in and saying, yes, let's do this so that we can dump all these plastics that, and Kenya has a ban on single-use plastic bags. Okay, so they're like, yes, now we can use the trade agreement to get rid of that terrible ban and sell more pesticides and GMO, seeds. So yes, there is a role for that, and but it should be a very different kind of model, not only because this is bad for the UK and everybody else, but also because they're in a different place and need different things, and we need to be respectful of that and be encouraging the building up of capacity to make decisions themselves and to do things they want to do. And actually, they're way ahead of us in the U.S. in terms of many of these policies. So, and that's a recognition people need to have. That this isn't like, well, we're over here, we know everything. There's some really good stuff going on there, including in South Africa and other places around intellectual property and competition law. We don't have all the answers, and we need to be thinking differently about all of this.
Nick,
yeah, that's really interesting.
The last word.
Well, I think that's right. And look, I think if you look at on a global level at the terms of trade, there is still more than a whiff of neocolonialism about those terms of trade. I mean, the idea is that they will grow all of our food, provide all of the metals that go in our phone for very, very cheaply, and we will make the expensive stuff. The same as we did in the empire. To listen to Liz Truss, you would honestly think that. Go on, Mary. Go on.
Well, I was just going to say what actually happens is they stop producing their stuff because actually US agricultural goods are cheaper. They're dumped on there.
Yeah, to some degree, that is true. Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting as well, isn't it? Because the agricultural industry increasingly is about Western multinationals going in and producing stuff. But really, to listen to Liz Truss, you would think that Kenya was going to become, incredibly prosperous off selling us beans, and it's not ever. And so for me, I think a lot of countries are in a different place, and they would do much better to increase their trade links with each other and to trade with each other, and come back to from a position of strength in terms of how they trade with us. I'm not saying we should stop trading with developing countries tomorrow. Of course I'm not. And of course countries can benefit from trade with richer countries, but they can also be incredibly detrimental. And the idea that they're going to become wealthy through trading with us, I think is a very, very far off the mark. And one of the things we've got to watch out for with our post-Brexit trade policy at the moment is precisely the British government doing deals like it's done with Kenya at the moment, which undermine regional trade relationships, which have built up over recent years, literally trying to recreate those colonial ties where they just trade with us because that means they're going to be trading an awful lot of, very, very basic products that essentially is never going to build prosperity in those countries. Well,
this has been really fascinating, and there's a huge amount of work to be done to construct a really good, I hope Emily Thornberry's listening, to construct a really good Labour trade policy, which should be the next step in open Labour. So thanks very much to both of you. I don't know if either of you had anything you were burning to add, but if not, I think we've got to the end.
Great. Thanks for a good job moderating.
Bye.